Hello and welcome to the Journal of Emerging Sports Studies Power of Play Digital Symposium. We are here now for our fifth session's question and answer segment. This session being grouped under the title Media Representations of Sporting Identities. And a quick note to anyone who's watching us, all of the presentations are available on our website at emergingsportsstudies.ca, which I encourage everyone to go see. So I'd just like to start off this session by having everybody introduce themselves, maybe who you are, where you're from or at, and what your research is more broadly. And Ornella, we can start with you.
Sure, thanks. So I'm Ornella, Nzindukiyimana, and I currently teach social sociology and history at San Francisco State University, Center for Short, in Antigonish, Nova Scotia, which is where I am right now. And my research, or the paper that I presented, was on the Read the North branding campaign for the Toronto Raptors, and the ways in which the usage of the notion of North in that campaign was surprisingly successful, but probably not too surprising either, because it called upon very familiar tropes of Canadian identity that kind of weaved in, or that pulled in a specific notion of being Canadian, being from the North, being not from the US, and also somehow weaved in these extra identities that usually do not get counted as Canadians for just the purpose of, for the branding campaign and hoodwinking a little bit into kind of perpetuating this post-racial type of discourse that we have often in, I suppose, the West, but in Canada also very specifically.
Fantastic. Yeah, it was a great presentation to watch. I really enjoyed it. Next, we can go to Braden and Stacy. Perhaps, Stacy, you can start, and then we'll go to Braden.
Okay. My name is Stacy Lorenz. I'm a professor at the University of Alberta, Augustana campus in Camrose, Alberta. And I teach there mainly in the areas of, I teach in both physical education and history. And I teach history of sport, sociology of sport, sport and popular culture, and also an interesting interdisciplinary course called Hockey, Culture and Commerce. And my research areas have mostly been focused on Canadian media and sport historically, also hockey violence and masculinity. And I've also done some work, and that's where this presentation lies, although it's kind of at the intersection of masculinity and violence and looking at race and hockey. And Braden is a former student of mine, and I'll turn it over to him now.
Thanks, Stacy. Yeah, I'm currently a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto in the Faculty of Kinesiology and Physical Education. Broadly, my current work focuses on the intersection of risk, sport, and injury. And I work with Professor Margaret McNeil and Professor Michael Atkinson out of our faculty there at U of T. But yeah, this research today, our presentation today, is back from my undergraduate work, some work I did with Stacy way back when at the University of Alberta Augustana campus, and have it really is what started to sort of critically engage my brain in terms of socio-historical perspectives of sport and asking more critical questions about sport culture and the production and reproduction of that culture.
That's great. So one of the ways that we've been introducing these sessions as a way of getting to know one another is posing this first question to everybody. And we just want to know, how did you come to your particular research project for this conference? What was it that attracted you to the topic in order to start engaging with this topic? Ornella, we can start with you.
Great. Interesting. Yeah, great question. So We the North started around, 2015. It was initially, I suppose I didn't realize it at the time because I have not necessarily kept up with the Raptors throughout all their years. And at some point, they just were not worth following. So I just very much was unconnected. But around 2015, they were celebrating their 20th anniversary, having been introduced in '95, and I mean it was a big deal because, of course, when they were introduced in '95, they were introduced with the Grizzlies in BC, in Vancouver, but the Grizzlies didn't last very long, so the Raptors did, and the Raptors, I suppose in their 20th anniversary, decided to very much branch out of that Barney kind of character, the what is it, the purple dinosaur, to this claiming of Canada as their territory, because they're the only ones left. They're the only major basketball team up north, if you will. So them using "We the North," which was very catchy, which especially became, I mean, kind of nicely coincided with them starting to rise and becoming a regular at playoffs, even though they didn't get very far thanks to one LeBron James. They still did. They caught my attention with that use of the North, because to me the North, and as a historian as a sport historian, as a researcher in Black Canadian sport history, and with an interest on those questions of race and in the Canadian sporting culture, it was interesting to me to use the North, which evoked, these images of winter and coloniality with the Raptors, a Black team for all intents and purposes. We're talking about the NBA, 80% Black. And so the attachment of those two just intrigued me. But I was in the midst of my PhD research, so it was not something I took up right away, but I definitely thought it was worth looking into. And I suppose I waited for someone to kind of pick it up, someone who could sort of validate the fact that this was very odd and very fascinating from a social, cultural, historical point of view. And eventually, I ended up finishing my PhD, and no one had really kind of dove into it. There is one paper, I think, that was published around 2019, and that's the only one where a researcher did interrogate the use of the North and the way it raises Northern cultures, Northern Indigenous peoples. Because if Toronto is the North, then what's left? Then I mean the North then disappears, because then there's nothing more if Toronto is where you stop at North. And so they interrogated that from an Indigenous perspective, and I saw the opportunity with a few colleagues to pick it up from that multicultural lens, and that what I presented here is a bit of what was left on the cutting room floor, and there's a lot there to be honest. The topic is just it's so many pieces. The Nav Batia, the number one fan part, is just its own dissertation by itself. And so I thought, let's get that conversation going, and hopefully we can we can get there and get to those pieces as we go in the next few years. The good thing about history is that it's not going to go out of, it's not going to expire. It's the whole piece is going to still be there and relevant, well, in the next few years.
Yeah, I think we can all speak to that in terms of waiting around for somebody else to do something and then kind of getting disappointed that nobody is or very few people are, and then you're like, you know what, I think I can do this, and there's an opportunity right now, I'm going to do this. I think we can all speak to that and understand that. Okay, next we'll go to Stacy and Braden. Maybe Stacy first and then Braden.
Okay, well, as I mentioned, one of my main areas of research has been looking at violence in hockey, and in particular its connections to various ideals and contested forms of masculinity in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Much of that research I've conducted in collaboration with my colleague in sociology, Garrett Osborne, and some of it I've done on my own, and we examined pretty thoroughly Stanley Cup hockey challenges and prominent teams like the Ottawa Hockey Club, colloquially known as the Ottawa Butchers, during the early 1900s, to see what kinds of discourses were present around hockey, masculinity, violence, etc. And also a couple of court cases in which hockey players were killed during that time. So after, completing a lot of that work, we looked around and saw that there was actually a lot of unwritten history of violence in hockey in the period after that, particularly from about 1910 into the 1970s. And so we had a number of case studies we thought of pursuing, and one that we decided to start first was a look at Gordie Howe and how he represented these ideals of masculinity in the post-war period, particularly through his combination of physical play and bashfulness, I suppose, is what how we describe it. And so that's where Braden entered into the picture, and he did a project based on Gordie Howe and also some research as a research assistant. And we've been working on that for a number of years now. We're hoping to see that one of those studies in print shortly. And I also had this other work I had done with my colleague Rod Murray, who unfortunately passed away before any of it came to print. And that was work on the policing of blackness in hockey and also basketball, but in the hockey context, looking at Ray Emery, former mainly as a goalie with the Ottawa Senators. And so from that, we actually saw that there were a lot of connections there in terms of the standard of white heroic masculinity that Gordie Howe embodied, which has been incorporated into hockey culture since then. And then we started to also see that this standard was often, in effect, weaponized against Black players, in particular in the NHL. And so that's where our work here developed. Not sure, I kind of hogged the spotlight there from Braden, so if he has anything to add to that, he certainly is welcome to.
Thanks, Stacy. Yeah, I mean, not too much to add, just that I started out the original sort of directed reading project looking at Gordie Howe and some historical narratives, so combing over historical newspapers and microfilm and so on, and getting a sense of sort of how Gordie Howe was represented. And then we looked specifically at sort of an infamous fight in Gordie Howe's career with Lou Fontannato, and worked on sort of how that fight was represented. Again, Gordie Howe being sort of this calm, humble, always in control figure versus Nana was very much portrayed as sort of emotional and uncontrolled, and a beast that was sort of humbled by the real man in the room, and so on. So we took some of those narratives, and as Stacy said, throughout some various presentations, we've applied it to more contemporary versions of hockey, and sort of the superstar's code of conduct, and various other contemporary examples of how sort of narratives of Gordie Howe are used to police the current game. And today, as Stacy mentioned, that our presentation involves looking at how blackness and black bodies and black athletes are policed within the game through some of the narratives that, again, we saw in our original work with Gordie Howe.
That's great. Okay, so I'm just gonna open it up to the questions that we've collected. And again, if anybody has questions for any of the panelists here, you can just wave your hand and I will come to you. So our first question is for Ornella, and it comes from David Galindo from an email communication. So David's question is there any evidence to suggest that the Raptors championship run created lasting relationships / friendships or discourse amongst a diversity of peoples who would have otherwise never become acquainted in Toronto and beyond? If so, could this suggest something that started as a capitalist artifice was transformed by fans into something more meaningful?
Wow, okay. That's an interesting question that is to be explored, I suppose. I don't think, and as I said, not much has been really done on this question of basketball as the new supposed new national sport, and its effect, and the effect of the run, and the whole phenomenon of Jurassic Parks that kind of started at the core and then sort of expanded into the Greater Toronto area, and then lately just across the country from coast to coast. So that would be something to be explored, whether it did bring people together that otherwise would not have been, and in meaningful ways that do not just entail finding yourself in a fan zone and kind of cheering together and then going your separate ways. When we're talking about the ways the Raptors and the We the North movement had an effect, and the way this was portrayed in the media, often it was more concentrated upon the bringing together, just this vague idea of bringing together the nation as a whole. I do not believe I remember seeing any examples of, oh, these are groups of people that are not friends thanks to the Raptors. There was I think a portrayal of this, well, this idea that basketball became a bit more acceptable, and you had, I forget what their name is, but it was a group of young hijabi girls who play basketball, and whose playing of basketball was connected somehow. I mean, a connection was made between them playing the sport and We the North and the Raptors, making it, I suppose, okay for them to play, or okay for them to be seen playing. The Nav Bhatia sort of storyline, the number one fan, who's a Sikh man who came as an immigrant, who I think he was trained in maybe like as an engineer or something, but did not find work in that field, so went on to become a car salesman and made it big. Ended up, I think, owning the place, and it became sort of a success story. The Canadian Dream story was always presented not necessarily as connections, but definitely as a way to showcase how the Raptors were connected to this notion of integration and assimilation, and you coming in, you know, well, showcasing this idea of multiculturalism and that ideal, that great ideal of Canadian policy and Canadian culture that really no one can quite explain what it means. He was very much held up as the poster person for it, especially when the Americans picked it up as the, hey, this is how we understand Canada to be, this perfect place where a Sikh man is a millionaire and you know, and doing so great, and this is everybody, this is all Canadians. And the Jurassic Park also, I think from the US, was picked up as that, as well as, oh my gosh, look at how Canadians, how perfect they are, not like us who are so, well, you know, who are Americans. So I think the Americans just saw it and ran with it, with this image of the Raptors representing this union that on the ground is not really there, because as they were going up, as this was happening, you still have many tensions in Toronto, more specifically around race and violence and anothering of Blackness, and they're just very, I mean, many issues that are very much unresolved. One of them being that whole image of hoops that are taken out because people complain about them being loud and being associated with youth, youth of color, which contrasts with that whole idea that somehow the Raptors are bringing people together. If kids are still told that, you know, the basketball thing, this shouldn't work out, it doesn't work out, it's too loud, let's put down pickup hockey instead. That's a bit what's the norm. And I think there was an article that kind of picked it up where people were defending themselves about, you know, calling the police on these kids playing ball, and saying that, hey, the hockey thing, that's what we are, and this whole other thing is kind of weird, is just dissonant. It doesn't connect with people in real life, but the campaign would have you believe that, you know, a nation of nations came together, and has stayed together as well. I think that's the important part. It's not, they maintain that this is a permanent thing, a deeper thing than just a campaign. So yeah, it definitely merits exploring and sort of going on the ground and doing that kind of research where they're looking at actual evidence of whether there is something to be said about it. But so far, nothing has looked like any, you know, like what they claim to be. Nothing has really shown evidence of that.
Right. That's really interesting. I'll come back to that. I have a follow-up for that, but it's kind of its own question. So I'll ask a question to Stacy and Braden, and then I'll come back to the other question that I have. So for Stacy and Braden, this also comes from David Galindo and kind of picks up on the similar themes of that previous question as applied to your research. And David asks, would you both contend that the We Skate for Black Lives campaign is yet another example of the NHL's colorblindness and their inability to truly, quote, rock the boat?
Braden, do you want to go first this time?
Yeah, sure, I can. I mean, I think my answer is going to be pretty short. I think that the We Skate for Black Lives campaign and all of the sort of moments that were had over the past few months here within the sporting world, and that the National Hockey League sort of consistently came up short on is, yes, yet another example of color blandness, and sort of trying to fit into both narratives, that yes, we're a diverse group, but still it's a very exclusive group, and we stand for the anthem, and so like a very concerted effort not to alienate a certain demographic of their fan base, and so yes, I certainly think that we saw lots of that at play over the course of the summer and into the fall here, and what maybe was a little bit different was I think that we saw actually some good journalistic work, and good public sociology, and that they were certainly called on it, and that was something refreshing to see, because it's not something that we've typically seen within hockey culture and those covering hockey. There was space given to voices that are just so important for us to hear, and again, that was I think refreshing this summer.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. I would concur. I mean, I think it is a case of, to draw on that metaphor again, like the boat wasn't rocked, it was missed. And I think that while we did see tiny fragments of awareness and progress, ultimately it was lost far too much in, as Braden said, just kind of these generic and performative expressions of, you know, really not a thorough self-examination, but more of a that performative element that just didn't go very far and wasn't substantial, and too often was left to individual players like Matt Dumba, for example, with an unfortunate lack of support from white allies and teammates, and also from the league as a whole, that maybe because of the different dynamic of number of black players in the NHL, for example, you didn't have the same opportunity for player mobilization that you saw in the NBA, for example. So so that's how I would concur with Braden in his characterization of that.
Braden, you made a point there, and I think there's a question out here where all three of you could answer, where you talk about how you mentioned how the media during this time was quite surprisingly good, like in terms of promoting good public sociology, as you say. What's underneath that statement, I think, is this recognition that the media has, as an entity, perpetuates these problematic ideas, and this is kind of what Ornella kind of speaks to in her presentation. I'm wondering what all three of you would say to maybe this statement that, or the question of, is the media, broadly defined, improving in this regard overall, or is it still kind of like just a minority of journalists and media platforms that are really promoting significant change, but the vast majority of these media organizations are counterproductive, and there's still a lot of work to do? Maybe Ornella can start, and then Stacy and Braden can jump in.
I think short answer is a lot of work to do. It seems a lot of times when a good point or a good direction seems to be taken, it's almost by accident, as you know, they're sort of taking up a storyline or an argument that has that just seems popular at the time, or that just fits at the time, and kind of run with it. But then I think it's going to be interesting to see how it develops beyond this moment, which we started moving away from. Once things come back again next year, are we going to see that happen again, or are we going to go back to, you know, shut up and dribble mode, where, you know, the technicalities of sports are what the focus is on, and we forget about everything else. For example, you saw you saw many of our colleagues all of a sudden appearing very much more in sports media and just media in general, the news and CBC and so on, and you know, they were taken up. But I think a lot of the attitude was, I'm going to talk now because we probably won't get called again. It's very soon the calls dry out because we've moved on to the next big thing, because the media is very fickle, and then, you know, it's forgotten. So unless I think some sports sociologists were speaking to the fact that unless you have a space for it that is permanent, you know, so almost like a sitting sports sociologist on a staff alongside the Stephen A's of the world, then it's going to be very difficult to actually maintain that momentum and not sort of almost accidentally bump into a good critical analysis of sport once in a while, and then just move on again.
Yeah, I think I would mostly agree with that. That was very well said. And I would say, much as Ornella started that off with, what I say to my classes all the time: yes, there's been some progress made, but not nearly enough. And I think we have seen some greater diversity of voices. I know that you know, I've read some stories in the last year or two that you wouldn't have seen before. There's some people who do seem to have a platform, more so than they did previously. I mean, I was doing some research for my class. I was mentioning before we went on the recording here, looking at the Toronto Raptors, and I came across some work by Morgan Campbell at the Toronto Star, for example. Now he's with CBC. That was very much more layered and complex than normal takes. And even journalists like Bruce Arthur at the Toronto Star, who engage these issues much more seriously than you might have seen in a typical sports columnist previously. And also a wider range of voices in other media that are out there. But still lots of work to do and a long way to go. And is this just a moment, or is this something that will extend? That's an open question for sure.
Yeah, and I would concur with both answers. I think that Stacy mentioned performative in his first answer before we got to this question. I think that is something that we always have to question with the media. It is a capitalist endeavor that is designed to make money and get views and sell products, and I think we can't ignore that fact with the progress that we've seen over the course of the last few months. That is the ultimate reality. At the same time, I think we have seen space given to really important voices, like I think of Shireen Ahmad, given space on TSN, and just such an important voice in these conversations. And so it's great to see that. And I think that there is a certain feeling of momentum that is important for us to capitalize on and continue to force media conglomerates and public discourse to more critically engaged questions. And so, yeah, I think that the opportunity is there. Like Stacy said, I think it's an open-ended question at this point. I think that we do have a responsibility as sort of critically engaged scholars to continue to push into that more public realm and engage in these conversations and provide space for those important voices. Yeah, so hopefully we can continue to do so.
Yeah, and just to add, just briefly, even I think it's also encouraging that we did see even from the mainstream media some questioning of this that we might have not seen before. So, for instance, the night that you know, the NBA shut down and essentially a strike that the players were on, and the NHL games went forward, you had Kelly Rudy on Hockey Night in Canada, you know, openly saying, "Why are we playing? This is absurd. We should be talking about these issues, not playing hockey." So that's something that's also unique, I think, and different from what we saw before. But of course, is that, you know, was that just one voice one night, or is there any momentum there to carry that forward? We haven't seen enough of it.
Mm-hmm. That actually segues very well into my next question for Ornella. Ornella, you mentioned in your previous answer that We the North kind of symbolized this notion of a nation of nations coming together, which really perpetuates that Canadian stereotype that we all love to believe in, that we're a multicultural society, and we just love it when the Americans call us multicultural, and it just makes us feel really good. Yet, over the past 6 months or so, we are clearly moving into a different era where, with Black Lives Matters, and in the Canadian context, in addition to Black Lives Matters, our history with Indigenous peoples, all of this attempting to acknowledge and find solutions to what makes us different. And I'm wondering, how has the We the North campaign, slogan, whatever you want to call it, navigated thus far, and how will it in the coming months or indefinite future?
It was
That's such an easy and simple question you just asked her, Andy.
I just have one answer in a sentence, and I think that'll cover it. Wow. I mean, it was interesting to me to see how when everything happened and everything shut down and then came back in the bubble, and the decisions that were made by the front office and with the Raptors, and the bus, the Raptors bus being the only one that was essentially a big Black Lives Matter banner. And, you know, they did it on purpose, and they definitely drew I think Masai Ujiri talked about it being, you know, being conscious of the fact that they were going to be driving through Florida for a long time, and basically taking the opportunity to carry that message through the whole state, as they you know, in a passive way, because, you know, it was not big, but at the same time it was huge. But on the other side, you had Draymond Green questioning what was behind that, because what do you mean Canada is I don't know exactly what was behind actually his thought process there, whether he thought the Raptors were the only Black people in Canada, that somehow no Black person exists outside of that, and so why would they take up that kind of messaging? It was very, I mean, it sort of did showcase that attitude that the campaign or the movement, it's always hard to really qualify it, the Black Lives Matter is fighting against, which is that, you know, people exist and people matter, and the continuing to sweep them under the rug just has got to stop. And so the taking up of the mental from the Raptors side, and the way the at least that franchise has really engaged with the questions and the discourse going around has been exemplary compared to everybody else. It's been mostly the athletes that powered things, whereas with the Raptors, it just seems that the front office is with them, as you know, in addition to the athletes being front and center. But somehow all of that seemed a bit disconnected from We the North, because We the North is always the break of, okay, so we're fighting for these, the social justice, but let's take a break to celebrate this, the Canadianness of this, which always like then brings in the North just cannot, or the notion of the North just cannot escape the imagery it brings with it, which is the traditional Canada, the colonial Canada, the Great White North Canada. So there's a bit of a disconnection there. I don't think they're abandoning it because it's such a big, campaign and lucrative campaign, and possibly one of the most successful campaigns in sport, in Canadian sport history. So I don't see them letting it go, but I'm not sure how they can put those two together, because when they say We the North, it's supposing a unity that's not there, and then on the other side they're saying Black Lives Matter, saying that it is that there is this unity. So can those two things exist at the same time? I'm not sure. So yes, it's a very it's going to be a fascinating next few years to see how that unfolds, because the team is one thing, and then how the media then also processes it is another. When you start getting into the playoffs and the excitement of the games, and We the North really just kind of bubbles up and brings up that pride that you're talking about, all of a sudden we really want to all believe in this ideal, which I suppose is not such a bad thing. But it doesn't really help if it's just a slogan, and then we move on to banning people from doing things because of who they are, and then treating people poorly because because we see them as lazy, and all those general day-to-day actual Canadian practices that with regards to racial relations, Indigenous relations, and so on.
Can I just ask, my question I was going to ask you, and you've kind of already touched on it there, but I just want to push it a little bit further. Like, first of all, let me say your presentation was awesome. I'm very welcome caution to our eagerness to attribute this level of unity and harmony and all of that to the Raptors. And pointing out the historical context and the roots of We the North and its limitations and so forth. But that's where I wanted to ask you something about that is, while recognizing that deep colonial winter whiteness of the North, I still wonder if there's not something more subversive and disruptive about the Raptors being involved in that slogan and the imagery that they bring to it. Like, can you see some subversive and disruptive component to that, or is it just wholly lost in those other images you talk about with the North?
I think that was my initial reaction to the North, was that this is the first time you're seeing a possible start of a different imagining of the North. I think that is there, where they do propose possibly a blending, a reimagining of the North as not just, you know, as really almost just a location that happens to have all of these people in it. So I think it has a lot of potential to go there. Um, and to see also essentially that campaign being successful because it's bringing in the old in order to attract and make sure it's familiar to the old guard, and then also bringing in this newer and, or well, imagined newer, because it's not new, they've been here for hundreds of years, but you know, it's bringing in this disruptive image and trying to blend them blend them together. So I think it has that potential and has that part of it, and that's what makes it exciting and easily sort of embraced, because it is proposing that, oh, we've all actually managed to live together in this North, in this traditional North. But then when this is done without the deeper actual acknowledgement of why we need to blend these things together, why there is a need to create a bridge, then I think it kind of falls apart and reverts back to just, you have to fit into this mold that we've created or else. So yes, I think it has the potential with the right context. I'm not sure the right context is presented and sort of set up for it though. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very I mean, again, just it's so complex. There's no easy answers to this, and you just spoke to that complexity again, where yeah, you have that subversive potential, but how is it realized? And you absolutely, you know, we have to be very cautious about, you know, equating a successful marketing campaign, as you said, with some new era of multicultural Canada. So yeah, these are really interesting questions and conversations.
I mean, I had, oh, Jason, I see you have a question. Just, no, just to sort of connect, because when I was doing this and then got to see your presentation, a lot of the whole Kawhi Leonard episode to me was very hockey, or connected to hockey, in that to me Kawhi Leonard was like a hockey player in basketball. That whole humbleness, the quietness, the head down work thing, and not, you know, being, well, the abrasive player that we usually, or the label of abrasive player that we usually would associate with a Black player or just a basketball player in general. So I was very curious as to whether hockey people, quote unquote, saw that, because to me that's what it connected to, the Kawhi Leonard and the way he was embraced and the way he was just, you know, in a hockey nation type thing, that somehow he was very much a hockey player on a basketball court.
Okay, you've just given us the title for our next paper, the King of the North, Kawhi Leonard and Blackness and Canadian identity. I never thought of it that way directly, but I think you're onto something, because, you know, you certainly see, you know, even in hockey, the sort of safer Black players act in certain ways that more conform to those norms. And in a sense, I think Kawhi did do that in a basketball context. Maybe that's a very interesting application of our ideas there. And maybe, I mean, one of the things that was motivating our work was trying to understand the unique ways that race and racism play out in hockey. So to try to get past sort of this, I think there are similarities in terms of, you know, different sports, how we would see blackness and whiteness in those sports, but they also have their own unique elements. And this is something I was talking about yesterday in the keynote during the presentation on Beardy's Blackhawks, was sort of how you can, you know, rather than just being a general problem of racism in society, we can see that in sport, there's particular ways that racism manifests itself, and that racism and that blackness is policed and so forth. And we also see in different sports, there's another level of uniqueness to that. So this might be more that some of these things in common between even a sport like hockey and a sport like basketball. And I mean, some of my own work looking at Ray Emery alongside the NBA dress code, for instance, shows some of that. And this might be a turning on its head of kind of these hockey ideas in a basketball context, with Kawhi's humbleness and blandness maybe being more relatable to Canadians who were used to that, or more inclined to support that because it was less disruptive and it was less confrontational than, you know, Dennis Rodman or something coming to Canada. So I think that's a really interesting thing. We're gonna have to, that's something to keep in mind for sure. Thank you.
No problem.
Jameson, you had a question?
Yeah, I actually have a couple questions for the presenters if we have time.
Yep.
So first of all, just thank you to all of you. I thought the presentations were awesome that you all gave, and I actually watched each of them a couple times because the ideas there are fabulous. I guess my first question is just for Stacy and Braden. Also, just thank you, Stacy, for your Ray Emery paper. I've cited it in the past, and it's a fabulous paper. And it really sort of addresses a gap in hockey scholarship because there's not much consideration of race or its mandates in hockey. But I guess my first sort of question is, do you think the expected hockey masculinity that you discuss in your paper is complicated by player position? So most of the examples that you cite, Braden, in the first half of the presentation are of centers. And so I'm wondering if something like the stereotypes surrounding the goalie and the sort of myths complicates the hockey masculinity that you've discussed.
Yeah, I think absolutely, and that's a great question. Thank you for bringing it forward. I think that it's sort of the positional dynamic that we see in other sports in terms of, like, you think of football and the quarterback and the sort of penultimate leadership position, and I think that the center has come to represent that in hockey over the years. And that's why many of the examples that you bring forward, like that we have brought forward and that others have brought forward, are of center. And I think, like, I think of PK Subban as a defenseman, and I think if he was potentially a center, I think that there would be maybe some different discourse around his attitude and so on. It seems like sort of the defensive mindset is even more so. You're supposed to just go and do your work. You're not supposed to be in the spotlight. You're not supposed to be extravagant. It's a role where you're just meant to go do your job. And I think that PK Subban challenges that notion. And that our white Western media has a really hard time accepting that. So I do think there's definitely some positional dynamic in there, and comes down to sort of leadership and some of the qualities that we highlight and look for within athletes that I think Gordie Howe and the media representation surrounding him played a large role in. Stacy, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, really, yeah, the only example we really mentioned, and it was kind of a sideline, was Bobby Orr, and you know, some of his quiet leadership being praised. I mean, the other direction I would take that question that also complicates things, and something that I've been doing some thinking about, is where do enforcers come into this as well? Because hockey is really an interesting sport in that, and I think this does get back to the whiteness of hockey that insulates, and this is where excuse me, this is where our work on masculinity and violence also intersects, is somehow the whiteness of hockey, I think, makes hockey immune to some of the criticisms that you would see of sporting violence, where somehow, because it's mostly white players, violence is okay. And the other interesting thing is that somehow that dynamic also actually carries over to black players who are able to meet that standard. They're much likely to, you know, they're not seen as thugs or as being, you know, these violent, out of control athletes in a hockey context, because there is that appreciation for and respect for and understanding of violence as somehow necessary, and the role of the enforcer being really necessary. So you see an overrepresentation actually of Indigenous players and black players in the enforcer role, but they're somehow able to take on, it's like they're insulated from that criticism. Even Ray Emery, when he, arguably the peak of respect for Ray Emery was when he was a fighter. Like, that was actually seen as a positive. Whereas in another sport, of course, in basketball, if the black players are fighting, I mean, that's the end of the world. So there's some other really interesting dynamics there that also are worth exploration, and I think relate maybe to some of that with position and role and so forth. And yeah, those are some other considerations I think we could build on moving forward. Thank you.
Jameson, you said you had another question?
Yeah, as many questions as we have time for, because again, both of these presentations were fabulous, and I think they sort of speak to each other too. One of my questions for Ornella was with, I guess, the recent offseason of the Toronto Maple Leafs. They've had Wayne Simmons, Joe Thornton, and Jason Spezza signing on a hometown discount to play in Toronto. And I'm thinking about how in recent years, Canadian basketball players have sort of reached superstar status with, like, Jamal Murray or Gilgeous-Alexander probably going to reach that in the next year or two. And so I'm wondering, how do you think if a Canadian player of a sort of Kawhi Leonard caliber or LeBron or Jamal Murray signs in Toronto, how will that complicate ideas of blackness? And blackness, as always in the Canadian context, is always someplace else, and never from Canada, sort of what you've talked about in your presentation, and what Ronaldo Walcott also talks about, how blackness is never centered in Canada. So I would just love to hear your thoughts on this hypothetical potential situation.
Yes. These questions are so simple and easy. I was looking at this, speaking of last season and everything that just wrapped up with, what's his name? Davies, the young soccer football player now in Europe, who just won the Champions League with Bayern Munich, and biggest sports star I would say we have in that sport in Canada, and his background, it being that he was a refugee who came in, landed in the prairies, and somehow in the sports system, in the Canadian sports system, in the Canadian soccer system, somehow made it to a level that led him to be picked up by a big European franchise. All of those things bring back often to him being, oh, well, he's a refugee, and being more of the example again of that multiculturalism of, look, we took in this kid and look what he achieved thanks to us, and we he owes all of this to Canada being Canada, and this great multicultural country. Like, the whole thing comes back again. So it would be very much interesting with kids like Jamal Murray and Alexander, and what there's the other one as well who got picked up by the Knicks as the second pick.
RJ Barrett.
Yes, RJ Barrett. And there's no background, there's no immigration background other than, they're just Canadian. So it will be interesting to see how that plays out. With Jamal Murray, you saw that, Basketball Canada promoted him a lot, and there was a lot of hype over him. Whether they complicate, they can definitely help bring just a spotlight on Canadians, or just Canadians that happen to be Black. How it'll play out is really difficult to say, because of the ways nothing has ever, it's always been a one-off. If I use a historical lens to answer that and look at how it has played out in the past, it's always been that, who's the goalie again who played for the Ottawa Senators? What was his name?
Ray Emery?
Emery, yes. Just like Emery, just like people like, if I'm thinking of Donovan Bailey, it was they never did escape the what we need and want our Black players to be. So when you look at historically how that has played out, if you can't fit, you're either from outside, or you're forced to fit into this box, or else you're just disruptive. You come back to that all the time, from all the way back from Harry Jerome being called all kinds of disruptive, all kinds of disrespectful, a boy, someone who just couldn't contain himself, to Ben Johnson being upheld and then dropped like a hot potato, and then Donovan Bailey just somehow, he did well, he didn't still, he I suppose learned, there's literature on this that suggests that he learned from Ben Johnson's experiences, and really was very comfortable claiming his Jamaicanness and his Canadianness both at the same time, because he was aware of the fact that he could never be fully Canadian anyways, so he just kind of embraced both. But yeah, he was always, again, he was disruptive as well. He was not humble enough. He was at some point he dared suggest that there is some racism in Canada, and faced a lot of backlash over that. So have we learned our lesson? Well, so far, the athletes we have are not speaking out a lot. So when we're talking about people like DeGrasse, and you know, he's doing well, but I suppose the Olympics being cancelled doesn't help in that. So with an athlete like that, unless it's an Olympic year, it's always hard to see them in the spotlight. So yes, it's to be seen. It'll depend on how this conversation continues. It'll depend on whether these athletes take a stand and really speak up. It'll depend on a lot of things, because Canadians are always they kind of, yeah, it's always in movement, but the historical precedent doesn't lead me to think there's going to be much change. I think they're still going to be expected to behave a certain way, and will be very much shunned or reprimanded for not being exactly what you would want them to be, which is be very reverent to Canada and to what it has offered them to be, and what it has allowed them to achieve.
That's fantastic. Well, I see that we're kind of approaching our time, and my internet connection's kind of giving out for some reason. So I think we will end it there. But yeah,
is there space for one small question?
You have a question? Sure.
Yeah, from Braden and Stacy, because when I was again listening to that to that presentation, to that research, and I went to Google Paul Newman, James Dean, Clint Eastwood, to see what age bracket, like what period they were in, because to me, when you're talking about the way that kind of masculinity that him as a hockey player represented, it brought to image these other popular masculine figures of the time that were present in a different kind of media. And I was wondering whether you drew any connections to that, whether they kind of fed each other, maybe, when you're talking about these iconic white masculine men. I don't know if Marlon Brando fits there, whether he was too much of a rebel. I'm not even sure James Dean, but definitely Paul Newman would have probably fit that kind of mold of this very, this just icon of masculinity, post-war, and all of those contextual characteristics. So I was wondering if there's any connections to be made there, whether they would have helped feed each other, because there would have been these very visible, similar images.
I'll start, and then I'll probably trade it over to the historian. But I think, again, a great question, and you raised some great points, Ornella. From our starting point, like Stacy had said, he and Garant had sort of identified the post-war era as a space within hockey that there hadn't been much research and much exploration of sort of masculinity, race, all of these different dynamics that we're speaking of today. But it had been sort of identified as post-war historians as a time where masculinity was very much perceived to be in decline, excuse me, as or we see a migrating workforce. There's no more white-collar jobs, women are entering the workforce, and so on. And so I think that's where we framed the Gordie Howe reference around. I think there's certainly other the white sort of stoic figures throughout that time period, and even today, that we can draw on, that sort of fulfill that role as well. And I'm not as familiar with some of the examples that you bring up, but I think there are certainly plenty of examples, and that Gordie Howe was just one example within the hockey realm. But I'll pass it on to Stacy to add more to that. Thank you.
Hey, I'm not even old enough to know some of those references, but no, I think that's there definitely would be, I think, some connections to be made there between, you know, the broader, as Braden indicated there, sort of the broader 1950s anxieties about masculinity and sort of this sense of, you know, just like you see earlier during these periods like the 1920s, these periods of prosperity, and they go too far and men are becoming too soft, and we need to restore this declining masculinity. And we do see that in some of the ways that sport and athletes, male athletes, are represented. And I think we do also see it in terms of wider popular culture, Hollywood movies, and so forth. Braden will recognize one of my favorite articles that I still use in my teaching, which is Nick Trujillo's piece on Nolan Ryan and hegemonic masculinity, where he's seen as this cowboy and John Wayne figure. And I think that Gordie Howe, in some of our other work, we play up a bit more his sort of rural Saskatchewan cement toting masculine strength that is part of the construction of his masculinity as well. So he's kind of this figure that is, you know, he's both this new rational man, the cool, calculating, rational man, but he can also be this old school, traditional man as well. And so that's something we're sort of trying to sort through as well in our work, is how, I keep saying how, but how Gordie Howe is kind of this figure in between there, that you can draw on both elements there in his in portrayals and expressions of his masculinity. So yeah, but definitely I think there are connections there to wider cultural representations of, reflections of, and articulations of masculinity, for sure. Thank you. That's a great question.
Yeah, that's fascinating. You mentioned old time hockey, Stacy, which kind of is a great segue into our afternoon session with Jameson. So maybe we'll end it there. That was a fantastic talk. Thank you, everybody who showed up. I learned a lot, and I'm sure everybody else will who views this online on our website. And yeah, we'll see you all at 1 p.m. For our third distinguished speaker address today with Dr. Janice Forsyth from Western University.